Why is matcha so expensive? This is a question we get asked all the time, and because so much goes into producing matcha tea, we find it difficult to answer in a sentence or two, so we decided to make a whole video about it. In this video, we're going to try to answer why is matcha so expensive and explore all the steps that go into making some of the world's best matcha teas. Before we get started, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and stay tuned for future tea videos. We have hundreds of tea videos on all sorts of topics related to Japanese green tea, but for this episode, we're going to focus on matcha specifically. If you'd prefer to read about matcha tea, we have tons of articles on our blog at neoteas.com. You can check the link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. So why is matcha so expensive? Here are the 11 main reasons. Number 1, matcha only grows in specific geographic locations. Although powdered tea has its roots in China, matcha as we know it today is really a product of Japan. The farmers we meet with in Japan have been producing matcha tea for many generations, and this multi-generational knowledge makes the product much better. Although it is possible to find some high-quality matcha produced in other countries, the best matcha in the world all comes from Japan. This really limits the production capability to a small geographic location and a handful of talented farmers. We will get into the supply and demand side of the equation later, but suffice to say that Japan makes up a relatively small percentage of global tea production, and yet it's responsible for almost all of the pinnacle matcha production. This is one way to answer the question, why is matcha so expensive? Number 2, the first harvest. Premium matcha always has to come from the first harvest. During the wintertime, the tea plant has a few months of rest period where it builds up nutrients from the soil and releases them into the fresh sprouts of the springtime. These sprouts are the highest in nutrients and the sweetest in flavor, so they are reserved for the most premium teas like kabusecha, gyokuro, and of course, matcha. After these leaves are harvested, the tea plant will flush several more times, but these sprouts will be lower in nutrients and flavor because they won't have as much time to build up nutrients from the soil. The fact that premium matcha can only be made once a year leads us one step closer to answering the question, why is matcha so expensive? Number 3, extra labor to set up the shading. Another reason why matcha is so expensive is because the tea plants need to be covered in a special type of netting called kabuse. This netting is carefully stretched over the top of the tea plants to protect them from sunlight. Of course, this takes extra capital to purchase the netting, as well as extra labor to set up the netting. Sometimes a bamboo scaffolding needs to be set up for hand-picked teas so that people can harvest teas underneath the netting. This of course takes even more time and resources from the farmer and drives up the price. Number 4, the shading of the tea plants. When tea leaves are exposed to sunlight, they begin to convert theanine into catechins. Theanine is the amino acid that gives tea its sweet and savory flavor, and catechins are what gives the tea its bitter flavors. A tea that's higher in catechins will be more bitter and therefore less suitable for matcha. By cutting off the tea from sunlight for 3 weeks before the harvest, it creates a leaf that is higher in theanine and lower in catechins. This extra shading step takes a lot of time, so shaded teas tend to be more expensive to produce, and matcha is no exception. Number 5, the tea plant needs to be kept alive for 3 weeks without sunlight. Setting up the netting is just one part of the challenge. The second factor that makes matcha so expensive is what comes next. After the scaffolding has been set up, the tea plant now needs to be kept alive for 3 weeks without sunlight. This is a stressful time for the plant, and it needs to be strengthened in order to maintain its health for this long period of time. While most farmers would use chemical fertilizers to do this, organic farmers like Mr. Nakai do things the more natural way. He will use natural ingredients to supply nutrients to the tea plant without harming the surrounding ecosystem. This takes more time, but it's worth it to produce matcha tea in a more sustainable way. Number 6, the hand-picking process. A lot of times when people ask why is matcha so expensive, they are referring to hand-picked matcha, which can be even more expensive. The hand-picking process only occurs one day per year. People gather from all over the area to take part in the hand-picking of the tea. Of course, this requires additional labor and training, as tea picking is a very precise art. The tea needs to be picked just a few millimeters beneath the third sprout. Where this gets even more difficult is sometimes that the tea plant has a hidden shin or hidden bud, so the picking actually has to happen beneath the second leaf. This requires careful focus and training to be able to properly identify the different leaves on the tea plant. Number 7, careful leaf selection. The next reason why matcha is so expensive has to do with how the leaves are selected. After the tea has been shaded for 3 weeks, it's time to harvest it. For less expensive teas like bancha, the older leaves on the tea plant can be used, but for matcha only the top 3 sprouts can be used. These young sprouts are the highest in nutrients and they have the smoothest and sweetest flavor. They are also the highest in caffeine, which is one of the main reasons why matcha has such a high caffeine content. These leaves are harvested and steamed to prepare them for the next step of the matcha production process. Number 8, the removal of the stems and veins from the tea leaves. Another answer to why is matcha so expensive is because it has an additional step that is rare in the world of tea. The stems of the tea leaves are actually removed. These stems will detract from the sweet and savory flavor, which is mostly coming from the leaves. These details may not seem very important, but when a tea is ground into a powder, the flavor intensifies, so small imperfections in the tea become more apparent. This destemming process requires extra machinery, and it can also reduce the total yield of the tea, as the stems are included in the final weight. Both of these contribute to making the tea more expensive. Number 9. The grinding of the tea. Finally, after the stems are removed, the tea is ready to be ground. The leaves without the stems are called tencha, and they are put into the top of this large granite mill for grinding. In order to grind tea leaves into a superfine powder like matcha, you need an extensive network of grooves and a larger granite mill like this. These are not only very expensive, but they also take up to an hour just to produce 50 grams of this precious matcha powder. Number 10. The packing of the matcha powder. Once the tea is ground, it has to be properly packaged. This is one of the final reasons why matcha is so expensive, although it's not as much of a factor compared to the others. The matcha powder is incredibly sensitive to light, heat, and humidity, so it has to be very tightly sealed in an airtight container. It's also common for tins of matcha to be double sealed, which only adds to the protection. The shelf life is also shorter for matcha, and they are best consumed within a year or so of packaging. All these details and more contribute to the price of matcha powder. Number 11. The demand is higher than the supply. As promised, we will now return to the supply and demand to answer the question, why is matcha so expensive once and for all? Matcha has become famous for its natural sweetness, strong umami flavor, and smooth finish, which is very rare in the world of tea. As a result, producers work meticulously to perfect the ideal matcha tea. Once these flavors have been perfected, people are willing to pay a higher price for these incredible matcha teas. Even if the cost is a few dollars per gram, it's worth it for the occasional indulgence. Matcha is a tea for special occasions and even for special ceremonies, so a higher price doesn't necessarily need to accommodate daily drinking. When drinking some of the most prized matcha teas in the world, you will likely be partaking in a special Japanese tea ceremony. While paying $1 or $2 per cup may be expensive for an everyday tea, matcha drinkers don't mind paying a higher price for a special tea they can share with friends or family as a celebration. Hopefully, by walking you through these 11 factors, you now have the answer to the question, why is matcha so expensive? If you want to experience great matcha while still saving money, you can go for the Noike matcha. This is a super smooth okumidori matcha that's about half the price as some of the other premium matchas out there. It's made by a small farmer outside of Kyoto that produces some really great teas. If you want to further explore the world of matcha, we suggest you sign up for the monthly matcha club. Not only will you get premium matcha teas from all over Japan delivered to you every month, you'll also get a free tea whisk and teaspoon when you sign up. Thank you all so much for joining us on this adventure into the world of matcha. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. As we mentioned before, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and stay tuned for future tea videos. If you'd prefer to learn about tea in our blog, you can check the link in the description. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.